Hello, and welcome back to Online Education Across the Atlantic. We're getting into the warmer season, and it's great to have Neil back from his vacation. And as we're looking forward to our summer travel plans, today what we wanted to talk about is building on what Morgan's written about with online education and the perceptions that are coming out from research and other areas on, is online education on the decline because students really want to go back to on-campus, or is online education growing? Is that a good or a bad thing? And so what's the recent data showing about student demand, I guess is the best way to look at it, student interest and demand in online learning. So we're going to explore that today. But before we get to that, just there was a very interesting news article that you shared this morning, Morgan. So if you can share what that is, and I think it's worth a little bit of discussion.
Was that the cricket one? Sorry, no.
No.
No, it was about Drake University ending their relationship with Wiley, which is now RisePoint. And I always think of OPM or those kinds of edtech company relationships with universities as sort of being like marriages or engagements. You see the ad, you see the notice in the paper when people are getting engaged or getting married or whatever. You don't see it when they're getting divorced often. And the same with OPM relationships. So it's seldom I see things saying, yeah, they're splitting up, but they're bringing all the marketing and recruitment in-house. It was also striking because they mentioned the revenue share percentage, which was 30%, which was lower than I would have.
But the 30% was confusing to me because they said we pay them for X and
30%.
we pay
Okay.
30%. And I wasn't quite clear. Does that mean they have a split contract that's fee for service plus a small revenue share? So I wasn't quite clear what
that would make more sense in a way, I think. Yeah.
But to me, the part of the reason that jumped out, one is it's eight master's online programs. They've been doing it for a while. So here's a university that does have real experience. They've had success, but they're definitely going their different ways. It'll be interesting to track how well they do, because doing online marketing is not a strength of a lot of universities. I mean, yes, they're Arizona State, some others have pulled it off and are doing online quite well without any help. But bringing that in-house, I'd really be interested to see how they do over time. So I'm not trying to say they shouldn't do it. I'm just saying great test case
Yeah,
to
no,
watch.
absolutely, because that's like the one thing you'd want to sort of go out. I also was speaking with another university today, and they were saying that, there's a big centralization push on their campus. So the main campus wants to pull online marketing into the mainstream marketing department, which I also think is a little iffy.
Yeah, it's such an interesting area, isn't it? I find that particular area fascinating when thinking about strategies to compete with, OPMs or those that have much higher budgets. And I think there are certainly universities over here who have gone through divorces with OPMs who are, now looking at kind of different approaches and different ways of competing with others in the market, but not necessarily on the same terms and the same budgets that, an OPM would. But I was just interested in whether there was any kind of causes given, or
Not that I
I
mean,
guess it's not the sort of thing that you kind of find out in the press, really. It's sort of whispers in the background, isn't it, when you hear about those things?
there would most likely be reference to we need to get out of the contract, or there's a dispute. So my assumption is it's the end of a 10-year contract and we're essentially deciding not to renew. That's an assumption of mine, but there was nothing referencing potential negotiations
There
involved.
was a comment from the provost or something about we're losing a lot of money with that revenue share and things like that, but it was time to do it themselves.
But if it is the end of a 10-year contract, another reason this will be interesting to track is because a lot of the OPM contracts in the U.S. really were signed up in the mid 2010s. And that raises a lot of question as more and more of these universities come up for renewal. Are we going to see an increasing amount? I think it has to be increasing compared to what it used to be. But how many of them are going to try to do the same thing as Drake? Okay, we no longer need you. We can insource this. And can they do it? I mean, it makes me really nervous when I hear things such as a school saying we're going to pull the online marketing into the main marketing. My initial reaction is, oh, great. Instead of hours to respond to a prospect, it'll be within a week or two and we'll mail you a brochure. That's going to work great for you. So,
yeah, I mean, I have similar alarm bells ringing in my head around that kind of thing, but I equally have seen evidence that things are moving in kind of better direction in terms of some marketing capability in some universities. But yeah, I hope they understand. It feels like when you say, look, they were losing money and there's kind of talk about the kind of revenue share, I hope they understand what it means for them to then take on and to perform in a similar way themselves. I'd like to think that if they've had 10 years, then they hopefully have got a bit of a hunch on what they need to do.
By and large, chances are that money was not going straight into profits. It's going into marketing expenses. Well, now the university's pick it up. So it might be a net positive for them. But again, that's why I think this is a great test case to watch over the next few years of how Drake actually does this transition. And they'll have missteps. There might even be sort of a playbook if they pull it off. Hey, they screwed this up. They did this well. They adjusted. So I just find that a very interesting news item that is worth us tracking. The other thing we're getting is now that Neil's back from quasi-vacation and we're getting into the summer months, I'm going to be going to the Open edX conference in Paris that I think is July 2nd through 4th. I know. And yeah, I couldn't get the hotel I wanted out near the conference, so I'm staying in the Marais district. And yeah, I'll make it work. I'll make it work. But thank you for your sympathy. But they're doing that in conjunction with the eMOOCs conference, and that'll be very interesting. I've written about that case recently, and it's also, it seems like the Axum Collaborative, which is what happened with all the edX acquisition money, became a nonprofit. They seem to be putting a lot more effort into promoting or pushing Open edX. So that I don't know that I would fully add this to one of the LMS users conferences, but that's what I'm going to find out. In between coffee and cigarettes and everything else. Then the three of us are heading up to Leeds for the Digital Education conference, and we're really excited that we'll be doing this podcast, doing it live as part of the conference. And we're also going to be, or some combination of us is helping out with the session. So we're really looking forward to that Lead Summit, which I think is July 10th and 11th.
So. Are we going to have to adopt a sort of a cat to sit on Morgan's lap or someone's? I feel like, that's going to be one important missing element.
That
from
would
the
be
whole...
somewhere near the microphone purring. We could get that.
Yeah, we'll chat to Margaret about maybe adopting a cat for the day.
Before you joined, Neil, I was telling Phil that my cats wanted me to tell Phil that they hate him because I had to throw them out of the room before I started this recording.
Yeah, cats and kids are not very conducive to podcasting from home. I think we have to admit. So,
True.
So we're very much looking forward to that. Hopefully, anybody who has the chance or in Europe, would love to have you. Definitely come to the Leeds conference, and if anybody's going to the Open edX conference, I'd love to connect with you there as well. So with that, let's actually get into the subject at hand. And obviously, online learning, there are a lot of topics around it, but there seems to be a growing discussion, at least that we're aware of where is it going in terms of student demand, but also in this moving from a binary online face-to-face to more of a blended spectrum type of issue. But to set it up, why don't, Morgan, if you could summarize the two posts that you've recently written and why this has been interesting to you.
Yeah, so I sort of came across it. One was Educore's put out their student technology report, which they do sort of semi like annual-ish, and which I had a role in starting. But anyway, they put out the report, and one of the sort of take homes, they covered, I think, 6 topics, but one of the take homes was that students are increasingly not enthusiastic about online learning. They want on campus experience or on site experiences. But as you sort of start to read through the data and sort of think about it more, it becomes a much more complicated question than how they presented it. And the danger of that sort of presentation became clear to me sort of soon afterwards when I found an article in Forbes magazine by Derek Newton saying, "See, I've been telling you students hate online learning, and here's the statistical proof. Like they're all going away from online learning." And at the same time, I came across several articles about the University System of Georgia Board of Governors had a meeting, and Sonny Perdue, the Chancellor of the University System of Georgia, had sort of been on a rant saying, how come online, enrollment was generally going up, but a lot of that was driven by online enrollment, which was going up. The on-campus enrollment was actually dropping a little bit. And, he said, is this being driven by students or is it being driven by faculty? The insinuation was that it was being driven by faculty looking for convenience. And he said, we're spending all this money on these campuses. Why are we having them do online? We really need to get a grip on this. He did concede that the research that they have shows that students do just as well online as they do in person, so it's not about outcomes. So those sort of 3 things all mesh together, and I wrote a small post on Saturday and a longer post yesterday about it. I think there's a lot of complicated nuance in there
Yeah.
that should be unpacked.
And one thing I would just add from the EDUCAUSE report and your coverage of it is the fact of, I think the phrase they kept using was a preference, like there's an increasing preference for on-campus activities. Yet the way they ask it is for synchronous activities, such as a lecture, such as this type of group work. Do you prefer online or on campus? And their conclusion was, oh, it's gone up from 2 years ago. So there's for on campus. So that students prefer on campus. But it's not like students choose individual activities. They choose at a course level is where they make the decision. And second of all, when you frame it as synchronous, well, you might be using courseware in an asynchronous method for online. So if somebody's asking you, how do you do a lecture? Well, most people hate an online lecture, but that doesn't mean I'd prefer to take this course on campus. So it's data worth looking at, but just the way they framed it was frustrating from my standpoint.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's funny reading your analysis, Morgan, because I was kind of reflecting on these kind of things in more general terms in higher education. So we have probably our equivalent is maybe the GISC digital education student experience survey that we have that kind of asks similar questions around preference. And I think in the absence of a lot of reporting of this nature, obviously it's kind of valuable and helpful, but I think in a similar way, I often have questions around what this is really telling us, and I think the kind of survey preference approach is not without value, but it doesn't delve deeply enough for me. And I think in general, one of my quibbles in higher education in the UK certainly is I always think about that. I think is it the Nielsen normal group mantra where it's like, don't ask the user what they want, observe what they do. And I appreciate that's really difficult to do on a large scale when you're doing this kind of thing, but I just think about it in terms of thinking about these preferences side of things. I worry that the surveys aren't that an effective instrument. And I think when it comes down to thinking about things like online or blended or on campus, for me, the most telling thing is like who's if I can put it in these steps, who's buying what, who's actually enrolling in online, or who's actually enrolling in blended, or who's actually enrolling on campus, and not wishing to kind of oversimplify it, but I think those are I don't know, that's such a strong metric for me, over and above, I prefer this and that, especially when it's kind of sort of segmented down in the way that you're describing, Phil, around synchronous and that kind of thing.
So there's a famous anthropological study where they went around and asked people in a community, men and women, what proportion of the housework do you do? And it came out roughly 50%. And then they actually did an observational study, and it was more like the men were doing 25%. I'm sorry, but um, and I think, yeah, that's the same sort of thing with online learning. You've got to look at actual patterns.
If the question had been more around when you've chosen a course and then dive into why you've chosen a course, like if you set the context with what you're saying, Neil, what have you actually done? Start with that. Now you're in that. And if you start to ask, well, why is it? So, not to defend Sonny Perdue, other than the fact that he has a wonderful hairstyle like mine, but if his point is being concerned that faculty are pushing people to online because of faculty comfort or something that's not really student demand, then ask that question. Boy, our online enrollments are going up and doing really well. Let's ask students, why are you doing more online? So add the preference after you have sort of their action, I think, is an approach that would have been much better served. So maybe put those two cases together. But you also have asked the right questions, such as if you're really trying to get to preferences, don't limit it to synchronous. But then the other one, and you guys were talking about this before we got into the recording, was that it's no longer an purely online versus purely face-to-face world. So be careful with your question. Students might choose to do some online courses, some face-to-face, or they might like courses that are heavily, and this is where we don't have the right terminology, blended, hybrid, whatever the appropriate case may be. So ask them the appropriate questions as well.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, I had a quick glance at the JISC survey because I thought it'd be useful to just think about this alongside that. And yeah, there's that kind of sense of preferences around how you learn and where you learn and all those kinds of things. But I think for me, the kind of online on-campus contrast is also to do with, do you want to study in a way where, you're traveling to a campus is reduced? For me, that's often where these things, the crux of these things, it's not necessarily just about preferences. It's about, people's individual circumstances and whether that would be kind of valuable to them, and whether there's enough people, just taking the blended learning example, that would be valuable enough for them to do. Because I think that's often the kind of motivation for online learning. It's a kind of a choice for flexibility, or it's a need for flexibility. And so some of the kind of discussions that get into, on-campus students' preferences around the use of technology or online, I think, I don't get into those kind of areas as well, and you kind of end up getting a bit of a vague reading of things about preferences and less about kind of circumstances and demands and needs.
And there might be alternative solutions. Like I remember our discussion when we were doing more of a global survey around online and digital education. I forget the name of it, but the private university in Africa, that they were looking at that flexibility, where there's a lot of their students who really would like a face-to-face experience, but they can't get to campus. So they were building up a whole grouping of local little learning centers that you could come into to do your classwork, get somebody face-to-face who can help you. So it's sort of some sort of hybrid method, but they were responding to that flexibility need, which isn't always solved by fully online. And so I think it's so crucial to actually understand what is the need. Why are you making that decision to do what you do?
I'm interested as well in, and maybe this is too strong a way of putting it, but kind of the agendas that sometimes lay behind the interpretation of survey results. Because there's the kind of hint there, and obviously it's been picked up by other news agencies in the US about what this is telling us, and this is telling us maybe a decline in online enrollments. And I just wonder, is that part of a general climate at the moment? You've talked in the past around online being the target, and I know that's a slightly different area of kind of government and think tanks and stuff, but is there almost this kind of broader climate amongst groups of people that almost want there to be a decline and want that to be the story and to tell that story?
Do you realize how dangerous a question this is that you're asking, Morgan?
I'm just throwing the hand grenade over.
Yeah, I think there is. And, earlier today, Kevin, our colleague, and I were talking the three of us were talking a little bit about some of these sorts of agendas. And they do seem to be multiple of them. Some people just want to return to campus, and then others tend to see online as being predatory, because of the disparate results or whatever. And so some of those things come together in some different kinds of ways, and honestly, part of my thing with the Georgia example was I did notice that Sonny Perdue went to college in 1965. Perhaps we're dealing with things a different, from a long time ago, but I think there are just such a lot of different agendas going on there. And also just a way in which a lot of people, because of the pandemic, think they know what they're talking about with online, and they don't, because they just had that one particular experience.
Yeah, so getting into the politics of it, Sonny Perdue used to be the Republican governor of Georgia. He's definitely on the conservative side, or I assume so. His comment at the board it didn't imply a deep understanding of, the nuance behind this, but he also explicitly mentioned the investment in campuses. So that gets into sort of, hey, we've spent millions on these campus buildings. I'm a politician by nature. Damn it, we should be using all these things that you guys asked me for years ago. I'm putting words in his mouth, but there's sort of, from a conservative side, you do hear back to campus, the shutdowns were a disaster. And you also get this type of institutional view. Hey, we've invested in this. We're not really using the campus. And you have those things. The online is predatory, is primarily more on the liberal side. So the author of the Forbes article, I mean, he admitted it, give him credit for it. He said, I've been telling you that online was a mistake, and I thought I would get the proof, earlier, but I have it now from this EDUCAUSE article. He completely has an agenda. It's the opposite from a political spectrum standpoint, but it's ironic that they come to the same conclusion. Too much online is a bad thing, and it's coming from different agendas. So I guess my point is they're absolutely how people use the agenda, how people use the survey results is absolutely driven by agendas, particularly right now in the U.S. But there's a separate question, which is part of the dangerous one. Why didn't, Derek Newton, to his defense, he quoted the analysis in the report quite extensively. He wasn't just making up his own phrasing. He got it from the report. So there's that potential question.
Yeah, I think one of the things I find over here is that because I think online learning in terms of kind of press coverage over here is even more niche. I think it comes to the surface a lot more. It seems to come to the surface a lot more in the US than it does in the UK. But there's a sense in which whenever online is reported on, it's kind of the only real angle is its failure or its inadequacy or debating its legitimacy. And I know that happens over there as well, but because it's kind of even less reporting over here, there's those kind of things that that kind of happen, and it's almost a bit like, well, we'll only report on this if there's something negative to say about it, in terms of enrollments or efficacy. And I think that's a problem amongst the higher education press over here. But just reflecting on the kind of agendas, actually, the GISC one always feels to me like they want to be able to tell more positive things about online and digital. They want to say more. I mean, like, I think in the most recent one there was a sense in which some online teaching had kind of declined a bit, and it was kind of moving back onto campus, kind of, and it's sort of a post-COVID peak to coming down a little bit. But I actually get the opposite from them, of them really wanting to be able to show more that's happening, and maybe that's a little bit kind of because of the nature of the work that they're doing. But yeah, it was just an interesting difference when I read that.
Well, isn't that a challenge? I mean, I'm looking at you, Morgan, in particular, with all research. Then you need proper research design, because you're always going to have biases or preferences. So you need to come up with research instruments that separate that out so you can do an honest analysis. So it's an age-old problem in one way, but with online, you combine that with what you're pointing out, Neil, here's how we understand online. In the UK, when we talk about it, it's in this terms. In the US, it's not as niche, but quite often it's predatory versus expanded access. Like, there is a playbook of how to talk about it and what gets the trade press and national press interested in it. And that's the way media works as well. So I guess with both of those, there's sort of a, hey, this is human nature. It's not that there's not a problem, but we have to understand it and deal with it.
I mean, I feel like a Pollyanna or something like that, but in this area, as well as like in talking about some of the changes and challenges that are happening to higher ed in the US at the moment, there's sort of an unwillingness to sort of to take an honest look, in a way, to say these are good things, these are bad things. Both things can be true, at the same time. It's like there's polarization in people's thinking. You either have to be pro-online or anti-online, or something like that. And there's not a sort of sense like, yeah, there's a lot of crap online learning and there's a lot of crap on campus learning. It's
So actually, given all this, let me put you on the spot, Morgan. All right, what is your interpretation of the data? I don't know that you've seen the GIST data, but certainly the EDUCAUSE data. Is there a retreat, a shift in desire towards on-campus? Is there, at the same time, the numbers, I think, are pretty consistent, pointing to increases in online. Is that a good or a bad thing? So, like, how would you interpret the data?
I mean, to me, it's fairly clear that, yeah, they have retreated since 2020, but they're at a higher point than they were in 2019, and they're growing. They're continuing to grow. The interesting question is, at which point will they stop? What will that percentage point be? But to me, it's fairly clear that online is growing. But there was that whole period of COVID, which was weird, and we can't really think about that in a way, except to sort of think about the sort of impact. But everybody went online, and now more people are coming on campus, and some really like it and some don't. But and the age and the point in people's lives when they are, we've talked before about the Georgia Tech online masters in computer science. It's just been hugely successful in terms of getting people who wouldn't have up stakes and gone to go live in Atlanta to actually do a master's in computer science. I forget, but I think it's 1 in 10 people in the United States with a master's degree in computer science has a degree now from Georgia Tech, and that would not have been possible without the online. So I think, it's retreated since 2020, but it's growing.
But what about, and to keep putting you on the spot, you had mentioned the fact, well, that the answer to the same question, even if the question's flawed, there has been a gradual shift towards the answer being on-campus experience, synchronous experience. Do you know enough to take a guess? What does that mean? What's behind that increase?
No, I think it's a return to sort of normal. It's the sort of more traditional age students wanting to have that experience. Also, I think maybe people also sort of value human connection in a way now that I mean, I find I enjoy conferences more than I did because I didn't have that experience for a while. I was denied it for a couple of years, as we all were. Yeah, and so maybe it's that, but I think we need to explore what that is and why that is. I think there's also just another negative thing there, which nobody ever talks about, but I think on-campus learning can be very passive in the way that it's done. You sit there in the lecture, um, and it flows over you, and then you cram before the exam, and you do it. Whereas online, if it's done well, is much more interactive. I remember one time, actually, it was like in 2008 or 2007, I taught a course on campus, but I did a really different design. Instead of writing a paper, they had to make a video and blah, blah, blah. And one student came in and handed me the thing, and he said, "This is the worst course I've ever taken in my life. I learned a lot, but it was so much work." And I think online is a lot like that.
Yeah, I remember a story someone told me of kind of changing up the teaching style, and a student basically, massively complaining and saying, "Look, I came here for lectures. I want lectures. That's what I've kind of paid my money for. Just give me lectures. You're like, why are you kind of why are you kind of changing things around? This is kind of what I've signed up for." And I think that gets to an interesting point, because I suppose people might challenge me on this, but if you're kind of, particularly if you're kind of a young adult school leaver, if you're choosing on campus, and this is what's marketed to them, you're not just choosing the course, right? And the kind of lectures and the learning, you're choosing something much bigger than that in terms of the experience. And so, I think, yeah, it's difficult to compare them because you don't have all of that other stuff with online. And so, online, obviously has to be different in terms of the way that learning and teaching works.
So part of we're arguing for too much nuance, but so you really need to look at the decisions being made, what students are actually choosing. In that context, the preference, why did you choose this? Would you have preferred on campus? Maybe the answer comes down to maybe Sunny Purdue had a point, at least in some cases. I chose online because there was nothing else available because nobody would offer it on campus when I wanted that. Well, get that answer. But then, you're getting to these things besides the course. What are you really looking for? Like, what are your additional needs? And then I guess there's actually the fourth, and it goes back to that modality is not a binary choice. I've been arguing that a lot of the data since the pandemic in particular is saying, listen, a lot of times what students want, they need online for flexibility, but they would like some synchronous components for the human connection, for the engagement, and the case may be. And because they went through Zoom University, they say, oh, I get that. It can be done now. Don't tell me it's impossible. You have to be fully asynchronous. I'd like to have some of that in there. Morgan and I got an email. We'll keep it anonymous for right now. Somebody thanking Morgan for the post and pointing out how much her school was getting that feedback from students that they want more of this hybrid or blended approach. And they've acted on that to design it. So I guess, there are multiple dimensions that need to be investigated if we're going to try to improve what's offered for students.
Yeah, I think one of the difficulties as well on that is there are multiple options within the choice of an on-campus or a full-time, in UK terms, kind of experience. But I think you can compare the choice of on-campus versus online. But what I don't see in the UK is kind of the kind of products that are really explicitly blended. You might get an on-campus that uses blended in lots of different ways and has lots of different options that you described, Phil, but you don't have that evidence of these are a bunch of blended, explicitly blended products, if we can put it like that. And you can see, oh, well, X number of people are choosing this, X number of people choosing this, X number of people choosing this. Because it's always an interesting conundrum, like, is blended learning or, is that kind of more of an online flavor to the experience kind of desirable or not? And I think that's probably gets to the heart of why it's difficult, because you've got the kind of challenge of the survey approach, but you've also got the fact that within those courses there are varieties. And we had a report on blended learning a couple of years ago which basically said it didn't say this in these words, but it's a mess, because you've got one university saying blended learning is having a file on a VLE, and you've got one university saying blended learning is much bigger than that. So it's a kind of it's an annoyingly nuanced area to find out, but it isn't helped if the surveys aren't as well designed as they might be, I think.
Isn't the exception that proves the rule in the US, to back up your point, Minerva? So we had Minerva Institute, and they do advertise their hybrid environment, that you're going to be in a community, you're going to live in a similar area. Most of your content type of classwork will be online from your dorm room, probably. But then we're going to focus all the face-to-face on group activities and getting out into the community. So because you're talking about positioning, not just what happens in reality, but how it's presented to students so that they can make the choice. Minerva absolutely does that. But can you think of a second example to go along with Minerva where they actually present that middle, I wouldn't even call it a middle option, that different option that blends things together?
Yeah, and I was looking at this recently in the UK context, and the kind of courses that were explicitly blended actually seemed to fall on the same sort of side as a kind of an online degree or course. It was kind of very professional driven for a mature audience that needed flexibility. So even those that were explicitly positioned felt like they fell into the online education kind of audience category a little bit more, non-traditional category a bit more, than the kind of traditional student audience. So yeah, I'd almost love for a university to kind of step out and develop something for that audience that is kind of deliberately positioned in that way. Not because I think it's necessarily viable for them, but I just want it to act as a good test case for this kind of thing.
Well, Morgan, you just came back from University of Central Florida. They categorize various blended modalities in operations, but do they present that as a reason for students to choose to go to University of Central Florida? I know they operate this quite well, but do they present it that way?
I don't know if that's presented to students in that way, but they have such a strong relationship with Valencia and with the community college down the street and things like that. So students probably are aware of it. I met with one of their leaders of online learning who had herself, she found that she fell asleep in class as a regular undergraduate. So I got to get online. So, because that was the only way she could stay awake. So she did all her degrees online. And she's in a doctorate at the moment online. So I'm not sure if they market it, but they certainly have been doing, blended or hybrid, in the sense of replacing seat time with actual online time in two different varieties for a long time. And they've got some nice research, some of it about grades, some of it about student preferences, but you should check it out. And
so I think there's a number of schools in the U.S. who do it in operations. University of Central Florida is one, obviously Minerva, but there are a lot of them. But you've really asked an interesting question, Neil. I don't know if that's presented to students, because if we're talking about what do students choose, I guess that once they're in a program, like if I go to University of Central Florida, by the time I'm a sophomore, then it really matters which courses I choose at that point. But for freshmen, I wonder if they even understand the different options and what they mean. So it just adds an interesting wrinkle that it's not typically marketed to students, so they might not be aware of what the choices mean until they're already in a program.
And I've actually been doing a little research project around, in a way, internal swirling of students. So students on campus taking online courses, or these different kinds of things. And I have been asking people about how they communicate that to students, and generally they say they figure it out. It's on the registration page, you know, like they're not talking to its students a lot about it. So I would be surprised if they were marketing it. And then other campuses is like, why would people want to do that? You know, like it's really foreign to them. Whereas, you know, other campuses are sort of down the road. And certainly, I mean, I mentioned before about, you know, Arizona State. It's part of why they left Pearson, because they had students switching back and forth between different kinds of modalities. So it didn't make sense to work with that rev share anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's an important difference in our two kind of countries, because we don't really have that in the same way over here, to be honest. The kind of the shifting of modalities, not to say we don't have it at all, but it's not really as prevalent as it is over there. But I would just add, just changing tack slightly, is that we had some data out, which I keep meaning to write about when time allows, on online enrollment, and I think it kind of corroborates some of the things that you're seeing in that. For undergraduates, the trend line is generally up, but because of the pandemic, it's all been a bit all over the place. But our online postgraduate numbers are been kind of healthily and steadily growing as well. So similar story to tell around that over here, just for online.
You need to tell your
enrollments.
paying clients they need to back off on milestones so you can write more of.
I know. Yeah, I just yeah. That's a whole other podcast.
Yeah, but going back to this, because I'm thinking about this a lot now, but if there's, to a certain degree, the UK follows the US by 5 to 10 years in online education. You're experiencing now things that we did years ago. There are other things that are quite different, and thankfully you guys haven't had the massive political turmoil around online that we've had. So hopefully you'll skip that. But it's very likely that you will see a strong increase over the coming years into this swirling mix and match hybrid type of choice, and schools really saying we need to serve students online, on campus, hybrid courses, and let them choose as they move through their program. So it's very possible you will be seeing this over the coming 5 years if the past matches.
George Mason, and I can't remember the exact phrase, but George Mason has a phrase about, you know, facilitating student choice. That's like a slogan that they have, you know, that they're aimed at getting to enable students to be able to do what they need to do to get to the finishing line. And that was interesting.
This goes back to where we were talking about ASU GSV. We said if we ran a conference, you said there would be a lot of open seats at the bar. We did get a few social media comments after that podcast episode that people said, I'd go to that conference if you have it. But a lot of nuance here. You guys brought up 2 points that I think get almost no discussion, and I'd really like to highlight it. One, Morgan, you mentioned the point of the question is not about whether online's growing. It is, and so much of that is student preference. But there's a corresponding question of where does it plateau and what's the natural level where it ends. You don't see that being discussed, and I think it should be. And then your point, Neil, about student choice, like do they understand the options available if it's sort of a blended or hybrid choice? Is that ever marketed in the same way that face-to-face versus online is marketed to them? So are they even aware of what the options are? Those 2 things you don't hear discussed very much. So maybe this will be a trigger for us to cover it more.
And I think marketing too. We should do something on marketing. We were talking about that earlier.
Yep.
As long as you can be snarky and make fun of groups that mail out brochures 1 or 2 weeks later and think that's going to work in the digital world. As long as you can include that, we can do more of that. Yeah.
What? Snark? Never.
We can just let you loose on, you know, trad marketing, traumatic experiences. You know,
and I'll just push her to name names. Don't just give anonymous examples. Give an example.
Call people out directly.
I think you two have this bit going on that you want me to have no friends ever. Like everybody to dislike me.
Yeah. Hey, well, we're all going to like each other together in July. So, really looking forward to that. I'm going to post this coming week about both conferences that I'm going to be involved in July. And although I'm also going to Structure Anthology, Morgan's going to D2L. But certainly, would love people to be able to see us when we get together in Leeds. And it's great talking to you all.